Living with Grace, written by Raja. Chapter 1. The Quiet Doctor. The relentless sound of sirens echoed through the early morning streets of New York City. St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, a crumbling relic in the heart of Manhattan, stood as a beacon for the underserved and overlooked. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, illuminating the worn linoleum floors and faded walls. Dr. Benjamin Carter strode through the hallways, his white coat billowing slightly behind him. At 38 years old, Benjamin had become a cornerstone of the hospital, respected for his skill but known for his aloof demeanor. His sharp jawline and tired brown eyes betrayed years of sleepless nights and unspoken burdens. Patients appreciated his competence, but his colleagues often found him distant. He wasn't unkind, but he had perfected the art of keeping people at arm's length. Benjamin glanced at the clipboard in his hand, scanning the next name on his patient list. Another routine case. Another life hanging by a thread. He inhaled deeply, adjusted his stethoscope, and pushed open the door to room 214. Inside, Mrs. Eleanor Franklin, a frail woman in her 60s, lay propped up against the hospital bed's stiff pillows. Her chart indicated advanced congestive heart failure. She looked up as Benjamin entered, her pale face softening with a faint smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Franklin," he said, his voice calm but devoid of warmth. "How are you feeling today?" She struggled to sit up straighter. "I've been better, doctor, but I'm still here. That's something, isn't it?" Benjamin nodded, his face expressionless as he checked her vitals and updated her chart. "Your condition remains stable, but we'll need to continue monitoring fluid retention. I've adjusted your medication dosage slightly." Mrs. Franklin hesitated before speaking again. "You work so hard, doctor. Do you ever take time for yourself?" Benjamin looked at her, momentarily caught off guard. "There's always work to be done," he replied curtly, avoiding the question. He completed his notes, offered her a brief nod, and left the room. Encounters like this were routine, yet they left him feeling drained. The act of holding himself emotionally distant had become second nature, but it didn't make the weight of his work any lighter. The hospital cafeteria was a noisy, chaotic place, filled with the clatter of trays and the hum of conversation. Benjamin sat alone at a corner table, a cold cup of coffee in front of him. He rarely ate during the day, opting instead to subsist on caffeine and sheer willpower. Around him, other doctors and nurses chatted in groups, their laughter mingling with the sound of utensils scraping against plates. He watched them from a distance, feeling like an outsider. It wasn't that he didn't care about his colleagues, he simply didn't see the point of forming connections in a world so full of loss. His life revolved around his patients, yet even they remained strangers to him. "Dr. Carter!" A voice called out, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Dr. Emily Rhodes, a pediatrician known for her effervescent personality. She approached his table, her tray laden with a colorful salad and a bottle of water. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before sitting down. Benjamin nodded slightly, though his posture remained stiff. "You always sit here alone," Emily said, her tone light but curious. "Don't you get tired of your own company?" "I'm used to it," he replied. Emily studied him for a moment. "You know, Ben. Can I call you Ben? You're one of the best doctors in this hospital, but you've got the emotional range of a brick wall. What gives?" Benjamin arched an eyebrow. "I didn't realize this was a therapy session." She laughed, undeterred by his sarcasm. "Maybe you need one. We all do, working in a place like this. Don't you ever feel like it's too much? The sadness, the loss." He took a sip of his coffee, letting her words linger. "You learn to compartmentalize," he said finally. "It's the only way to keep going." Emily sighed. "That's not living, Ben. That's surviving. Big difference." Her words struck a chord, but he quickly buried the feeling. He finished his coffee and stood. "Thanks for the company, Emily, but I've got rounds to finish." As he walked away, her words echoed in his mind. Benjamin's apartment in Brooklyn was a reflection of its owner, neat, functional, and devoid of personal touches. The living room held a worn couch, a small bookshelf, and a coffee table cluttered with medical journals. A single photo sat on the shelf above the TV, a relic from a happier time. It was a picture of Benjamin and his younger sister, Clara, taken years ago during a rare family vacation. Clara had been the light of his life, vibrant, ambitious, and endlessly supportive. She had a knack for seeing the good in people, a quality Benjamin often envied. But her life had been cut short in a car accident when she was just 25. Her death had shattered him. In the years that followed, he threw himself into his work, using it as a shield against the pain. He told himself he was helping people, that his sacrifice was noble. But deep down, he knew he was running from grief, from connection, from life itself. That night, as he sat on the couch flipping through patient files, a sense of emptiness settled over him. The work never ended, yet it never felt like enough. The next morning began like any other. Benjamin arrived at the hospital before sunrise, his usual routine of coffee and paperwork already in motion. But as he checked the day's schedule, a new name caught his attention: Andrew Walker. "Who's Walker?" he asked Nurse Jenkins, a no-nonsense woman who had worked at St. Jude's for over 3 decades. "New patient in room 306, she replied. "Just admitted this morning. Late-stage cancer. You'll want to check his chart." Benjamin flipped through the file. Andrew Walker, 32 years old, diagnosed with an aggressive and untreatable form of sarcoma. The prognosis was grim. When Benjamin entered room 306, he wasn't sure what to expect. But the man who greeted him was unlike any patient he had ever met. "Good morning, doctor," Andrew said, his voice bright and cheerful. He was sitting upright in bed, his tousled brown hair and warm smile giving him an air of vitality that seemed at odds with his condition. "I'm Dr. Carter," Benjamin said, keeping his tone professional. "How are you feeling today?" "Fantastic, considering I've got the big C," Andrew replied with a grin. "But hey, you've got to play the hand you're dealt, right?" Benjamin was momentarily taken aback by the man's upbeat demeanor. Most patients in Andrew's situation were overwhelmed with fear or sadness. This man, however, radiated an infectious energy that filled the room. "Have you been informed about your diagnosis?" Benjamin asked, trying to gauge his understanding of the situation. "Oh, I know the drill," Andrew said, waving a hand dismissively. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. But I'm not here to mope, doc. Life's too short for that." Benjamin nodded, though he couldn't hide his skepticism. "We'll do everything we can to keep you comfortable." "Appreciate it," Andrew said. "But between you and me, I'm more interested in making the most of whatever time I've got left. You seem like a guy who could use a little fun. What do you say?" Benjamin didn't respond, but as he left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew Walker was about to turn his carefully controlled world upside down. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 2. A burst of sunshine. The sound of laughter rippled through the otherwise somber hallways of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. Nurses exchanged puzzled glances as they passed room 306, where the newest patient, Drew Walker, had been admitted just hours earlier. Drew's cheerful voice carried into the corridors, accompanied by the occasional burst of giggles from whoever happened to be visiting his room. Dr. Benjamin Carter stood outside the door, his brow furrowed as he scanned Drew's chart again. Rare, aggressive cancer, terminal diagnosis, 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. Everything about Drew's case screamed tragedy, yet the man on the other side of the door seemed intent on defying that narrative. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin stepped inside. Drew was sitting cross-legged on the bed, his hair messy and his hospital gown slightly askew. He was animatedly talking to Nurse Jenkins, who, for the first time in Benjamin's memory, looked genuinely amused. "And then I told the guy, if you're going to propose with that ring, at least make sure the diamond's real," Drew finished, slapping his thigh as he laughed. Nurse Jenkins chuckled, shaking her head. "You're something else, Mr. Walker." "Please," Drew said, waving a hand, "call me Drew. Mr. Walker makes me sound like my dad, and trust me, I'm way more fun." Benjamin cleared his throat, drawing both their attention. Nurse Jenkins quickly excused herself, leaving the two men alone. "Ah, the man of the hour," Drew said, his grin widening. "Dr. Carter, right. You're the guy everyone says is brilliant but kind of a buzzkill." Benjamin blinked, momentarily thrown off. I'm your attending physician, he said, recovering his composure. How are you feeling today, Mr. Walker?
Drew, he corrected. And I'm feeling fantastic. Well, as fantastic as someone with stage 4 cancer can feel. But hey, you've got to find the silver linings, right?
Benjamin stared at him, unsure how to respond. Most patients in Drew's position were consumed by fear or despair. Drew, however, seemed almost jubilant.
Have you had a chance to review your treatment options? Benjamin asked, keeping his tone professional. Sure have, Drew said. But let's cut to the chase, Doc. I know the prognosis. Chemo might buy me a few extra months, but it won't change the outcome. So, I'm thinking we skip the doom and gloom and focus on living. Sound good to you?
That's unconventional, Benjamin admitted. So am I, Drew replied, his eyes twinkling. But seriously, I get it. You're here to save lives, and I'm here to remind you that some lives don't need saving, they just need living. Now, tell me, Dr. Carter, when was the last time you did something fun?
Benjamin blinked again, caught completely off guard. This isn't about me, he said stiffly. Maybe it should be, Drew said, leaning forward slightly. You look like a guy who's forgotten how to smile. Am I wrong? Benjamin opened his mouth to respond but found he didn't have an answer. Drew's unrelenting optimism was disarming, and it made Benjamin acutely aware of the walls he had built around himself. Over the next few days, Drew became a whirlwind of activity in the hospital. He had an uncanny ability to draw people in, whether it was cracking jokes with the cafeteria staff, playing cards with other patients, or convincing a nurse to smuggle him a slice of pizza. Benjamin watched from a distance, equal parts fascinated and skeptical. Drew's attitude was infectious, but Benjamin couldn't help wondering if it was a mask, a way of avoiding the harsh reality of his situation. One afternoon, Benjamin found himself in Drew's room again, this time to discuss the results of some additional tests. Drew was sitting by the window, sketching something in a notebook. What's that? Benjamin asked, nodding toward the notebook. Drew held it up, revealing a surprisingly detailed drawing of the New York City skyline. Just a little doodle, he said. Helps pass the time. You'd be amazed how much you notice when you stop to look. Benjamin nodded, unsure what to say. He cleared his throat and opened the folder he was carrying. The scans confirm that the cancer has spread to your liver, he said, his voice clinical. Drew nodded, unperturbed. Figures. Can't say I'm surprised. So, what's next, Doc? More tests? Experimental drugs? We could explore a clinical trial, Benjamin said, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic. Drew shook his head. Nah, I'm good. I told you, I'm not interested in fighting a losing battle. I'd rather spend my time doing things that matter. And what matters to you? Benjamin asked, genuinely curious. Drew smiled, making people laugh, showing them that life's still beautiful, even when it's messy. You should try it sometime. Benjamin didn't respond, but something in Drew's words lingered with him. As the days turned into weeks, Drew's influence on the hospital became impossible to ignore. He organized impromptu karaoke sessions in the common room, shared stories with other patients, and even convinced Nurse Jenkins to join him in a game of charades. Benjamin, despite himself, began spending more time in Drew's room. Their conversations ranged from light-hearted banter to surprisingly profound discussions about life, death, and everything in between. One evening, as Benjamin sat by Drew's bedside reviewing his chart, Drew spoke up. You know, Doc, you remind me of me. Before the diagnosis, I mean. Benjamin looked up, surprised. How so? You're so focused on what's wrong that you forget to see what's right, Drew said. I used to be like that. Always chasing the next promotion, the next big thing, thinking I'd be happy later. But then I found out I didn't have a later. And you know what? That's when I started living. Benjamin frowned. It's not that simple, he said. Life doesn't just fall into place. Of course it doesn't, Drew said, grinning. That's the point. You've got to grab it by the horns and make it yours. Benjamin didn't know how to respond. Drew's philosophy was so different from his own, yet it was hard to deny the truth in his words. That night,
As Benjamin left the hospital, he found himself thinking about Drew's advice. For years, he had buried himself in work, avoiding relationships and shutting out the world. But Drew's presence had stirred something in him, a spark of curiosity, a faint glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, Benjamin wondered if it was possible to feel alive again. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 3. Unlikely Bonds. Dr. Benjamin Carter had always believed in boundaries. They were essential in his line of work, a necessary safeguard against the emotional toll of witnessing suffering every day. Yet, Drew Walker, terminally ill, endlessly charismatic, and impossibly full of life, seemed determined to tear down every wall Benjamin had carefully constructed. Drew's room at St. Jude's had become a hub of activity. Despite his condition, his energy seemed boundless. Patients, nurses, and even hospital staff who rarely interacted with patients found themselves drawn to his infectious positivity. Benjamin, to his own surprise, was no exception. It started small. During his rounds, Benjamin found himself lingering longer than necessary in Drew's room. Their conversations ranged from trivial topics like the best pizza in New York to deeper discussions about regrets and second chances. Drew had a way of steering even the most mundane topics into meaningful territory. One afternoon, Benjamin walked into Drew's room to find him attempting to teach a group of nurses how to juggle oranges.
Come on, Jenkins, Drew called, laughing as Nurse Jenkins, holding 2 oranges, fumbled the third. It's all about the rhythm. Nurse Jenkins rolled her eyes but was laughing too. Walker, I'm a nurse, not a circus performer.
Benjamin leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. And here I thought this was a hospital. Drew turned, his face lighting up when he saw Benjamin. Ah, Dr. Sirius has arrived. Care to join us? We could use some of that precision you're so famous for.
Benjamin smirked. I think I'll pass. Suit yourself, Drew said with a shrug. But don't think I haven't noticed you smiling more lately, Doc. You're welcome. Benjamin raised an eyebrow but didn't deny it. There was no point. Drew had a way of seeing through people. As the weeks passed, Benjamin and Drew's unlikely friendship deepened. For Benjamin, it was disarming to be around someone who lived so fully despite the shadow of death looming over him. For Drew, Benjamin's reserved nature presented a challenge, a puzzle he was determined to solve. One evening, Drew convinced Benjamin to sit with him after his rounds. The doctor hesitated but eventually pulled up a chair. So, Doc, Drew began, leaning back against his pillows. What's your story? And don't give me the, I'm just a doctor doing my job, routine. I want the real stuff.
Benjamin hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about Drew's unguarded nature made it hard to deflect.
There's not much to tell, Benjamin said eventually. I've been at St. Jude's for over a decade. It's fulfilling work.
Drew tilted his head, unconvinced. But, Benjamin sighed, but it's also exhausting. Sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. People still suffer. People still die. Drew nodded thoughtfully. You know, I used to think like that. I worked in finance. Big job, big paycheck, big stress. I thought if I just worked hard enough, I could control everything. Turns out, life doesn't work that way.
Benjamin glanced at him. What changed? Drew smiled faintly. Cancer. Funny how facing death can teach you more about living than anything else. Benjamin didn't respond, but Drew's words lingered with him long after he left the room. Drew's influence extended far beyond Benjamin. He had a knack for bringing people together, creating moments of connection in a place often defined by isolation. One day, he organized a movie night in the common room. With the help of Nurse Jenkins and a portable projector, he turned the sterile space into something resembling a cozy theater. Patients and staff gathered, munching on popcorn Drew had convinced the cafeteria staff to prepare. Benjamin found himself there too, standing in the back as Drew introduced the film, The Princess Bride.
This one's a classic, Drew announced, his grin infectious. It's got everything: sword fights, true love, giants, and my personal favorite, sarcastic humor. The room erupted in laughter, and Benjamin found himself smiling despite himself. Another time, Drew befriended a young girl named Mia, who was undergoing treatment for leukemia. At just 8 years old, Mia was quiet and withdrawn, the weight of her illness evident in her solemn demeanor. But Drew had a way of breaking through her shell.
He started by teaching her how to fold paper cranes, a skill he had picked up during his own hospital stays. Soon, Mia's room was filled with colorful origami creations. You know, Drew told her one day, there's a legend that if you fold 1,000 cranes, you get a wish. What would you wish for? Mia thought for a moment. To go home, she said softly.
Drew nodded, his expression gentle. That's a good wish. But until then, we'll make this place as much like home as we can. Deal.
Deal, Mia said, a small smile breaking through.
Benjamin watched these interactions from a distance, marveling at Drew's ability to connect with people. It was a skill Benjamin had never mastered, yet he found himself wanting to learn.
One rainy evening, Benjamin found himself back in Drew's room, this time without a professional reason. Drew was sitting cross-legged on the bed, strumming a battered acoustic guitar he had somehow procured. I didn't know you played, Benjamin said, surprised. Badly, Drew admitted, grinning. But I enjoy it. Want to give it a try? Benjamin shook his head. I'm not much of a musician. Neither am I, Drew said. That's the point. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to make you happy.
Benjamin hesitated but eventually took the guitar. His attempts to play were clumsy, the chords awkward under his fingers. But Drew cheered him on, laughing and clapping as if Benjamin were a rock star.
For the first time in years, Benjamin felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Joy, maybe, or the beginnings of it. As Drew's health began to decline, his spirit remained unshaken. He continued to spread joy wherever he could, even as the toll of his illness became more apparent. Benjamin, now a regular fixture in Drew's room, found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible. One night, as they sat talking, Drew turned to Benjamin and said, You know, Doc, you're not as bad as you think you are. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Drew laughed. Take it however you want. But seriously, you've got a good heart. You just need to let people see it.
Benjamin didn't respond, but deep down, he knew Drew was right. By the time Benjamin left the hospital that night, the rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, as if Drew's optimism had begun to chip away at the cynicism that had long defined him. Drew Walker was more than a patient. He was a reminder that even in the face of death, life could be beautiful, and that it was never too late to embrace it. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 4. Lessons in Living. The inevitable began to set in. Drew Walker, the man who had brought laughter, joy, and hope to St. Jude's Hospital, was showing signs of his illness progressing. His once energetic presence was now punctuated by moments of exhaustion, his voice sometimes softer, his movements slower. Yet, his spirit remained undiminished. For Dr. Benjamin Carter, this transformation was difficult to witness. Drew's zest for life had become an anchor for Benjamin, a reminder of the beauty in imperfection. Now, as Drew's body faltered, Benjamin felt an ache he hadn't expected, a mixture of helplessness and admiration for a man who refused to let his illness define him. One rainy afternoon, Benjamin found himself in Drew's room, staring out the window at the bustling streets below. Drew, propped up on pillows, was scribbling something in a notebook. What are you working on? Benjamin asked, turning to face him. Just some thoughts, Drew replied, not looking up. Memories, advice, things I want people to remember when I'm gone. Benjamin's chest tightened. That's morbid. Drew chuckled. No, it's honest. Besides, it's not like I'm writing my eulogy. I'm just leaving a little piece of me behind. You should try it sometime. It's therapeutic. Benjamin folded his arms. I'm not sure anyone would want to read what I'd write. Of course they would, Drew said, finally meeting Benjamin's gaze. You've got more to say than you think. Speaking of which, have you talked to your family yet? Benjamin stiffened. He had mentioned his estranged relationship with his parents in passing during one of their late-night conversations, but he hadn't expected Drew to bring it up again. No, Benjamin said shortly. Why not? Drew pressed. It's complicated, Benjamin replied, his tone dismissive. Drew sighed. Life's complicated, Doc. But trust me, you don't want to leave things unsaid. Take it from someone who's running out of time. Relationships matter more than anything else. Benjamin didn't respond, but Drew's words stayed with him long after he left the room. The next day, Drew orchestrated another one of his projects. This time, it involved writing letters to loved ones. I'm calling it Operation Gratitude, Drew announced to a group of patients and nurses gathered in the common room. We're going to write letters to the people who matter most to us. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be real. Even Nurse Jenkins, usually skeptical of Drew's antics, seemed moved by the idea. Benjamin, who had stopped by to check on another patient, watched from the doorway as Drew encouraged an elderly man to write to his estranged daughter. You'd be surprised what a few words can do, Drew said, his tone gentle. Benjamin's chest tightened again. He thought of his parents, who still lived in upstate New York. They hadn't spoken in years, their relationship fractured by misunderstandings and unspoken resentment. That evening, Benjamin sat in his apartment, staring at a blank piece of paper. Drew's voice echoed in his mind, you don't want to leave things unsaid. After what felt like an eternity, he picked up a pen and began to write. The changes Drew inspired weren't limited to Benjamin. His presence became a source of transformation for others at the hospital. Mia, the young leukemia patient Drew had befriended, began to smile more often. She started venturing out of her room, joining Drew in folding paper cranes or painting pictures in the common room. I want to make something for my mom, Mia told Drew one day, holding up a brightly colored drawing of a rainbow. She's going to love it, Drew said, his voice warm. Mia beamed, and Benjamin, watching from the doorway, felt a pang of gratitude for what Drew had brought to the hospital. One morning, Drew surprised Benjamin by asking him to sit in on a meeting with his family. They're coming today, Drew said casually as Benjamin checked his vitals. Who's coming? My parents and my sister, Drew replied. I haven't seen them in a while, and I figured it's about time we had a little reunion. Thought you might want to be there, you know, moral support. Benjamin hesitated. Are you sure that's appropriate? Appropriate, Drew scoffed. Doc, life isn't about what's appropriate, it's about what matters. And this matters to me. When Drew's family arrived, Benjamin was struck by their warmth. Drew's mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. His father patted his shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. Drew's younger sister, Emily, sat beside him, holding his hand.
The conversation was filled with laughter and reminiscing, but also moments of vulnerability. Drew spoke openly about his illness, his fears, and his gratitude for the time they still had together.
Benjamin watched silently, feeling like an intruder in the intimate moment. But something about the scene moved him deeply. It reminded him of the connections he had lost and the ones he still had the power to mend.
Drew's health continued to decline, but his determination to live fully never wavered. One evening, he and Benjamin sat together, the room quiet except for the hum of the city outside. Have you ever thought about what you want your legacy to be? Drew asked suddenly. Benjamin frowned. I don't think about things like that.
Maybe you should, Drew said, his tone thoughtful. You've got a gift, Doc. You help people every day. But don't forget to help yourself too. Benjamin didn't reply, but Drew's words struck a chord.
A few days later, Benjamin received a phone call from his mother. Ben. Her voice was tentative, almost disbelieving. I got your letter. Benjamin's throat tightened. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me.
Of course I do, she said, her voice breaking. We've missed you so much. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He made plans to visit his family the following weekend, something he hadn't done in over a decade. Drew's impact rippled through the lives of everyone he touched. He reminded him of the importance of connection, of cherishing the moments they had. For Benjamin, Drew was more than a patient. He was a teacher, a friend, and a catalyst for change. As Benjamin left the hospital that night, he looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't known in years. Drew's time was running out, but his legacy would endure in the hearts of those he had touched. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 5. Graceful Goodbyes. The inevitability of Drew Walker's condition became apparent as the days turned into weeks. Despite his optimism and the laughter he continued to share with those around him, Drew's body grew weaker. The once vibrant man who filled the hospital with warmth and joy now spent more time resting, his energy waning. Dr. Benjamin Carter watched the decline with a heavy heart. Drew had become more than a patient. He was a friend, a teacher, and a reminder of what it meant to truly live. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt the sharp sting of loss looming, and yet, there was a sense of peace in Drew's approach to his own mortality.
One evening, as the city lights twinkled through the hospital window, Drew called Benjamin to his bedside. His voice was softer now, but his eyes still held that unmistakable spark of life. "Doc," Drew began, his tone light despite his condition, "I think it's time we talked about the elephant in the room." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "If this is about the cafeteria food, I've already filed multiple complaints." Drew laughed, a weak but genuine sound. "No, not that. I mean, what happens next? For you, for everyone." Benjamin's chest tightened. "Drew, you don't need to worry about that. Just focus on resting." Drew shook his head. "Benjamin Carter, you are the most stubborn person I've ever met. Listen to me for once, will you?" Benjamin sighed and pulled up a chair, his expression softening. "Okay, I'm listening." Drew took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. "I know my time's running out. And while I'm not exactly thrilled about it, I'm okay with it. I've lived more in these past few months than I did in all the years before. And that's thanks to you." Benjamin frowned. "I didn't do anything." "Are you kidding me?" Drew said, his voice firm despite its frailty. "You've been my anchor, Doc. You let me be myself, even when I was annoying as hell. You gave me a chance to make a difference here, and that means everything."
Benjamin felt a lump rise in his throat. "Drew, let me finish," Drew interrupted. "Promise me something, okay? Promise me you'll keep living. Not just existing, living. Go see your family. Take a damn vacation. Maybe even learn to juggle." Despite himself, Benjamin chuckled. "Juggling might be a stretch." "Start small," Drew said, smiling. "But seriously, Doc. Life's too short to spend it all in your head. You've got so much to give, but you've got to let yourself feel it." Benjamin nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his chest. Drew's passing came quietly, in the early hours of a cool spring morning. Nurse Jenkins called Benjamin as soon as it happened, her voice trembling with emotion. "He just slipped away," she said, peacefully. He was smiling. Benjamin sat in his apartment, the phone pressed to his ear, unable to respond. The emptiness he felt was overwhelming, but there was also a strange sense of calm. Drew had faced his death the same way he had faced life, with grace, courage, and an unshakable belief in the beauty of the moment. The hospital felt different without Drew. His laughter no longer echoed in the halls, and his room, once a hub of activity, was now quiet. Yet, his presence lingered in the hearts of those he had touched. MIA, the young leukemia patient, folded her 1,000th paper crane in Drew's memory. She placed it on his empty bed, her small hands trembling but her face resolute. "He said it would bring a wish," she told Benjamin when he came to check on her. "I wished for him to be happy, wherever he is." Benjamin knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "I think he'd love that, MIA." At Drew's memorial service, the impact he had made on the world became even clearer. Patients, staff, and even strangers he had connected with during his brief stay at the hospital gathered to celebrate his life. Benjamin, who had never been comfortable with public speaking, found himself at the podium. "I've spent my career trying to save lives," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "But Drew taught me that saving a life isn't always about curing an illness. Sometimes, it's about helping someone truly live." Drew didn't just live, he thrived. He made us laugh, he challenged us, and he reminded us of what's important. For that, I'll always be grateful.
As Benjamin stepped down, the room erupted in applause, a tribute to the man who had touched so many lives.
In the weeks that followed, Benjamin began to make changes in his own life. He reconnected with his parents, visiting their home in upstate New York for the first time in years. The reunion was emotional but healing, a bridge mended after years of distance. He also began to volunteer at a community center, offering free medical advice to those who couldn't afford care. It was Drew's philosophy of giving back that inspired him, and for the first time in years, Benjamin felt a sense of purpose beyond the hospital walls. One sunny afternoon, Benjamin found himself in Central Park, sitting on a bench with a book Drew had recommended. As he turned the pages, he felt a breeze rustle the trees around him, a gentle reminder of the friend who had changed his life. He closed the book and looked up at the sky, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Drew," he murmured. Drew's legacy wasn't just in the memories he left behind, it was in the way he inspired those around him to live with kindness, courage, and an appreciation for the moments that mattered most. Benjamin knew he would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his life. And in that, Drew Walker would never truly be gone. The end. Please like the video and subscribe the channel.